June 4th, 1942, 10:22 in the morning. The Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly in all directions, a vast blue emptiness broken only by white clouds scattered across the sky. The air temperature at 15,000 feet is cold despite the tropical sun blazing overhead. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, squints through his goggles at the scene below. 4 aircraft carriers steam in a defensive box formation, their wakes drawing white lines across the dark water. Destroyers and cruisers surround them in a protective screen. On the carrier's flight decks, dozens of aircraft are spotted for launch, their wings folded, their engines being warmed up. Fuel hoses snake across the decks. Ordnance crews push bombs and torpedoes on carts. It is a scene of organized chaos as the Japanese prepare their planes for another strike. McCluskey knows what those preparations mean. If those Japanese planes launch, they will find and destroy the American carriers. The entire outcome of this battle, perhaps the entire Pacific War, hangs on what happens in the next few minutes. McCluskey keys his radio. Attack! Attack! Then he pushes his control stick forward, and his Dauntless tips over into a 70-degree dive. 36 other dive bombers follow him down, screaming toward the Japanese fleet at over 250 miles per hour. The Japanese carriers grow larger in the pilot's sights. Anti-aircraft fire begins to burst around the diving planes, black puffs of smoke appearing like dark flowers blooming in the sky. Tracers arc upward in graceful, deadly curves, but the American pilots hold their dives, nerves steady, eyes fixed on their targets. At 10:26 a.m., 4 minutes after McCluskey began his dive, the first American bomb strikes the Japanese carrier Kaga. The 1,000-pound bomb penetrates the flight deck and explodes deep inside the ship, among planes being armed and fueled. The explosion triggers a chain reaction. Aviation fuel ignites. Bombs and torpedoes detonate. Within seconds, Kaga is transformed from a functioning warship into a floating inferno. Almost simultaneously, bombs strike the carriers Akagi and Soryu. The same terrible sequence repeats on each ship. Explosions tear through hangar decks. Fires spread with horrifying speed. Ammunition cooks off in staccato bursts. Within 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 6 fleet carriers lie crippled and burning. By the end of the day, all 3 will sink. Japan's naval dominance in the Pacific, seemingly unstoppable for 6 months, will be broken forever. This is the story of the Battle of Midway, the most decisive naval engagement in the Pacific War and one of the most important battles in history. It is a story of intelligence and deception, of courage and sacrifice, of split-second decisions that determined the fate of nations. It is the story of how a nation reeling from defeat managed to achieve a victory so complete, so unexpected, that it changed the course of World War II. To understand Midway, we must go back 6 months to a Sunday morning in December 1941 when the world changed forever. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. At 7:55 in the morning, Japanese aircraft swept down on the American Pacific Fleet anchored in the harbor. Torpedo bombers skimmed across the water, launching their weapons at the helpless battleships. Dive bombers screamed down from above, dropping armor-piercing bombs.
Fighters strafed planes parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields, destroying them before they could take off. The attack lasted less than 2 hours, but the destruction was immense. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, over 180 aircraft destroyed, more than 2,400 Americans killed. The attack shocked the United States and brought America into World War II. But from Japan's perspective, Pearl Harbor was not a complete success. The attack had missed its primary targets, America's aircraft carriers, which were at sea and escaped unscathed. Admiral Arosoku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood this failure. Yamamoto knew that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would dominate modern naval warfare. He had staked Japan's strategy on destroying America's carrier force in a single blow. Pearl Harbor had damaged the battleship fleet, but left the carriers intact. This meant the war would continue, and Yamamoto knew Japan could not win a long war against America's industrial might. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japan achieved victory after stunning victory. Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific like a tsunami. Hong Kong fell in December. Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress, surrendered in February. The Dutch East Indies collapsed in March. The Philippines held out until May, but the outcome was never in doubt. Burma, Malaysia, most of New Guinea, all fell to Japanese arms. The speed and completeness of Japan's conquests stunned the world. In 6 months, Japan had created an empire stretching from the border of India to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the edge of Australia. It was the largest empire in Asian history, controlling territory inhabited by nearly 500 million people, and containing vast resources of oil, rubber, tin, and other strategic materials. But conquest is easier than consolidation. Japan's military leaders faced a strategic dilemma. They had achieved their initial objectives, securing resource-rich territories and establishing a defensive perimeter. But America remained undefeated and increasingly dangerous. Aircraft carriers had launched several raids on Japanese-held islands, including a shocking attack on Tokyo itself in April 1942, when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 Army bombers from the carrier USS Hornet to bomb the Japanese capital. The Doolittle raid caused minimal physical damage, but had enormous psychological impact. The Japanese military and government were humiliated. The Emperor's Palace, the sacred center of the Japanese nation, had been threatened by enemy bombers. How could this be allowed to happen? The military leaders, especially the Navy, felt intense pressure to ensure such raids could never be repeated. Admiral Yamamoto saw an opportunity. He proposed a bold operation to draw out and destroy the remaining American carriers. The plan was to attack Midway Atoll, a small American base in the Central Pacific. Midway was close enough to Hawaii to threaten the American position in the Pacific. The Americans would have to defend it. They would send their carriers to stop the Japanese attack, and when they did, Yamamoto's superior forces would destroy them. The plan was called Operation MI, and it was complex almost to the point of confusion. Yamamoto divided his forces into multiple groups. A diversionary force would attack the Aleutian Islands in the far north, drawing American attention away from the Central Pacific. The main carrier striking force, commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo and including 4 fleet carriers, would attack Midway itself, destroying the American aircraft based there. Behind them, Yamamoto's main battleship force would wait for the American carriers to appear. Once the Americans committed to battle, Yamamoto's overwhelming superiority in ships and aircraft would crush them. It was a good plan, on paper, elegant in conception, and promising in potential, but it suffered from several critical flaws. First, it assumed the Americans would react exactly as Yamamoto predicted. Second, it divided Japanese forces into groups too far apart to support each other.
Third, and most fatally, it assumed the Americans didn't know it was coming. They did know. American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code. Not completely. They couldn't read everything, but enough to understand Japanese intentions. Station Hypo, the cryptanalyst unit at Pearl Harbor, commanded by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been tracking Japanese radio traffic for months. By mid-May 1942, Rochefort was convinced the Japanese were planning a major operation against a target designated AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway, but he needed proof. He devised a clever trick. He had Midway send a fake message in plain language reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese radio traffic mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The trap had worked. AF was Midway. The Japanese were coming. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, now faced the most important decision of his career. He could keep his carriers safe in Pearl Harbor, preserving his force but surrendering Midway. Or he could send his carriers to defend Midway, risking everything on a single battle against a superior Japanese force. If he lost, the road to Hawaii would be open. But if he won, the balance of power in the Pacific might shift. Nimitz chose to fight. It was a calculated risk based on the intelligence Rochefort had provided. Nimitz knew when the Japanese were coming, where they were coming, and what forces they had. This knowledge might offset Japan's numerical superiority. Nimitz committed every carrier he had: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May and should have needed 3 months of repairs. Nimitz gave the Pearl Harbor shipyard 3 days. The workers performed miracles. Yorktown would sail with temporary repairs, but she would sail. Command of the American carrier force went to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard Yorktown, with Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance commanding Enterprise and Hornet. Spruance was not a carrier officer. He normally commanded cruisers, but he was brilliant, aggressive, and decisive. He would prove to be exactly the right man for the job. The American force was smaller than the Japanese fleet, 3 carriers versus 4, roughly 230 aircraft versus over 250. But the Americans had advantages beyond numbers. They knew the Japanese were coming. They could choose their position. They could strike first. And they had one other advantage: desperation. The Americans were fighting with their backs to the wall. They had to win. The Japanese, confident after 6 months of victories, underestimated their opponents. On May 28th, Enterprise and Hornet departed Pearl Harbor, followed 2 days later by Yorktown. The carriers and their escorts steamed northwest toward a position designated Point Luck, northeast of Midway. The position had been carefully chosen. It would allow the American carriers to strike the Japanese flank while remaining beyond the range of Japanese search planes. The American sailors knew they were sailing toward battle, but few understood how desperate the situation really was. The Japanese had more carriers, more aircraft, more experienced pilots. The Americans were outgunned and outnumbered. Their only advantage was surprise and determination. For many of the young men aboard those carriers, it would be enough. For many others, it would not be enough. They would die in the cold Pacific waters, their youth and promise extinguished in the service of their country. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet was also underway. Admiral Nagumo's carrier striking force, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, steamed toward Midway from the northwest. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Their pilots were veterans, their crews confident. They expected an easy victory. Behind Nagumo's carriers came Admiral Yamamoto aboard the massive battleship Yamato, the largest battleship in the world. Yamamoto commanded the main body of the combined fleet, including 7 battleships and numerous cruisers and destroyers. This force was intended to destroy the American carriers once Nagumo's airstrikes had softened them up. But Yamamoto's complex plan was already beginning to unravel. The diversionary attack on the Aleutians proceeded as planned, but it didn't fool the Americans. Nimitz ignored it and kept his carriers focused on Midway. Japanese submarine patrols that were supposed to detect American ships moving from Pearl Harbor arrived too late. The American carriers had already passed through the area. And most critically, the Japanese still didn't know the Americans had broken their codes. They believed they had complete surprise. On the morning of June 3rd, American search planes from Midway spotted elements of the Japanese fleet approaching from the west. The report wasn't entirely accurate. The planes had found transports and support ships, not the carriers. But it confirmed that the Japanese were coming. Admiral Fletcher, waiting at Point Luck with his 3 carriers, prepared for battle. He kept his carriers beyond the range of Japanese searches while waiting for reports of the enemy carrier force. The battle would begin soon. June 4th dawned clear and bright. At 4:30 a.m., Admiral Nagumo launched his first strike on Midway. 108 aircraft took off from his 4 carriers to attack the American base. Nagumo kept half of his aircraft aboard as a reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships. If American carriers appeared, this reserve force would be ready to strike them. At 5:34 a.m., an American PBY patrol plane spotted Nagumo's carriers and radioed their position. Minutes later, another PBY reported many planes heading Midway. The battle was on. Midway's defenders scrambled every aircraft they had, fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, sending them to attack the Japanese carriers or defend the island. The Japanese strike reached Midway at 6:30 a.m. Despite fierce resistance from the Marine fighters defending the island, the Japanese bombers plastered Midway's facilities. Buildings burned, fuel tanks exploded, but the airfield remained operational, and many of the American planes had already launched. The strike leader radioed Nagumo, "There is need for a second attack." This message triggered the first of several crucial Japanese mistakes. Nagumo had kept his reserve aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships. But if a second strike on Midway was needed, those weapons would be useless. Nagumo ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed with general-purpose bombs for land targets. This would take time, roughly an hour, but Nagumo believed he had time. No American carriers had been reported in the area.
But the attacks had accomplished something important. They had kept Nagumo's carriers busy, maneuvering to avoid attacks, launching fighters, recovering aircraft. The carriers couldn't launch a strike while they were under attack and dodging torpedoes. Every minute of delay was a minute closer to disaster, though Nagumo didn't know it yet. At 7:28 a.m., Nagumo received the report he had been dreading. A scout plane reported sighting American ships to the northeast. Nagumo demanded clarification. What types of ships? The scout was vague. Nagumo needed to know if there were carriers in that force. If there were, he had to attack them immediately. But his reserve aircraft were in the midst of rearming. Their torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, the weapons needed to attack ships, had been removed and replaced with general-purpose bombs for the second Midway strike. Changing them back would take more time. At 7:45 a.m., the scout finally reported enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo now faced an agonizing decision. He could launch his strike immediately with whatever planes were ready, but that would be a weak, poorly coordinated attack. Or he could wait to recover the planes returning from Midway, rearm them properly, and launch a massive, well-coordinated strike. Professional naval doctrine favored the second option. Nagumo decided to wait. It was the decision that would cost him the battle. Nagumo ordered his carriers to recover the Midway strike group, refuel and rearm all aircraft with proper anti-ship weapons, and then launch a full strike against the American carriers. The flight decks became scenes of controlled chaos. Planes returning from Midway trapped aboard, folding their wings and taxiing forward. Deck crews rushed to refuel them. Ordnance handlers removed general-purpose bombs from the reserve planes and carried them below to the magazines, then brought up torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs to replace them. Time pressure was intense. Everyone knew American carriers were out there. The mechanics worked at frantic speed, but certain procedures couldn't be rushed. Fueling took time. Ordnance loading took time. Safety procedures that would normally be followed carefully were cut short. Bombs that should have been returned to the magazines were instead stacked on the hangar decks to save time. Fuel hoses lay across the decks, still connected to aircraft. The carriers were loaded with every flammable and explosive material imaginable, all concentrated in a small area. By 9:18 a.m., the last of the Midway strike group had been recovered. Nagumo's 4 carriers turned into the wind to prepare for launch. If they could get their strike away in the next 30 minutes, they would still have the advantage. But they were out of time. The American carriers had launched their own strike hours earlier. At 7 a.m., Admiral Spruance had ordered Enterprise and Hornet to launch every available aircraft. Admiral Fletcher aboard Yorktown held back initially, wanting to keep a reserve in case other Japanese carriers appeared. But by 9 a.m., he too launched his strike. Over 150 American aircraft were now winging toward the Japanese fleet. But finding the enemy in the vast Pacific was not easy. Some squadrons flew the wrong heading and never found the Japanese fleet. Others found the fleet but attacked piecemeal without coordination. The first to arrive were the torpedo squadrons from all 3 American carriers. The torpedo bombers were Douglas TBD Devastators, obsolete aircraft that were too slow and too vulnerable. They had to fly low and straight to launch their torpedoes, making them easy targets for fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The torpedo squadrons knew this. Many of the pilots and crew knew they were flying to their deaths, but they pressed on anyway because that was their duty and because they believed their sacrifice might create an opening for others. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet found the Japanese carriers first at approximately 9:20 a.m. 15 Devastators attacked without fighter escort. The Japanese combat air patrol fell on them like wolves. Zeros shot down plane after plane. The few Devastators that survived the fighters long enough to launch their torpedoes were met by a wall of anti-aircraft fire. Not one torpedo hit. All 15 planes were shot down. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived. He floated in the water among the debris, watching the rest of the battle unfold. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked minutes later. The results were the same. Heavy losses, no hits. 10 of 14 planes were shot down. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown arrived. They too attacked bravely and futilely. 10 of 12 planes were lost. In less than 30 minutes, American torpedo squadrons had lost 41 of 41 devastators that attacked. Not one torpedo had hit a Japanese ship. But the torpedo attacks had accomplished something crucial. They had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. The Zeros were at low altitude, chasing the last of the torpedo planes. The Japanese carriers were maneuvering violently, turning into the attacks, their attention focused on the threat at wave-top height. And in the midst of this chaos, with everyone looking down, the American dive bombers arrived overhead, unopposed and unnoticed. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bomber squadron from Enterprise had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over 2 hours. McCluskey had flown the expected course but found nothing. Fuel was running low. He should have turned back. But McCluskey was stubborn and aggressive. He decided to continue searching, extending his flight southwest. At 10:05 a.m., his persistence was rewarded. He spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast, trailing a white wake. McCluskey guessed the destroyer was heading toward the Japanese fleet and followed it. At 10:20 a.m., McCluskey saw them. 4 Japanese carriers in a rough box formation, their decks crowded with aircraft preparing to launch. It was the target every American aviator dreamed of finding. McCluskey didn't hesitate. He split his squadron, sending half to attack Kaga, while he led the rest against Akagi. At exactly the same moment, by sheer coincidence, dive bombers from Yorktown arrived overhead and began their attack on Soryu. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. The combat air patrol was out of position at low altitude. The carriers were in the middle of launch preparations, their decks full of armed and fueled aircraft. Anti-aircraft fire began too late. The American dive bombers pushed over into their attacks, screaming down from 15,000 feet at 70-degree angles. McCluskey's first section attacked Kaga. The carrier desperately tried to maneuver, but she was too large and moving too fast to turn quickly. Bombs began to hit. One struck near the bridge, killing most of the senior officers. Another penetrated the flight deck near the forward elevator. A third hit midships. Each bomb detonated among the crowded aircraft on the flight deck or in the hangar deck below. Secondary explosions rippled across the ship as fuel and ordnance detonated. Within minutes, Kaga was a mass of flames from bow to stern. McCluskey led his section against the flagship Akagi. The first bomb missed, landing in the water close alongside. The second bomb hit the flight deck midships, penetrating to the hangar deck where planes were being armed.
The explosion was catastrophic. The hangar deck became an inferno. Fire spread with terrifying speed. Akagi's captain tried to save his ship, but the fires were out of control. Aviation fuel burned. Torpedoes cooked off. The carrier was doomed. The Yorktown dive bombers attacked Soryu almost simultaneously. 3 bombs hit the carrier in rapid succession. The first bomb struck the flight deck forward, among aircraft being prepared for launch. The second hit near the bridge. The third penetrated to the hangar deck. Like her sisters, Soryu erupted in flames and explosions. Her crew fought the fires desperately, but the damage was too severe. In 5 minutes, from 10:22 to 10:27 a.m., 3 Japanese fleet carriers had been transformed from powerful warships into burning wrecks. The pride of the combined fleet, the carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor and terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, were dying. Hundreds of sailors died in the initial explosions. Hundreds more were trapped below decks as fire and smoke spread. The survivors struggled to fight fires or abandon ship as their vessels disintegrated around them. Admiral Nagumo, aboard Akagi, was stunned by the sudden reversal. Minutes earlier, he had been preparing to launch a massive strike against the American carriers.
Now his flagship was burning and sinking beneath him. Nagumo was led from the bridge to a destroyer, where he transferred his flag and tried to make sense of the disaster. How had this happened? How had the Americans achieved such complete surprise? But one Japanese carrier remained operational. Hiryu, positioned some distance from the other 3 carriers, had not been spotted by the American dive bombers. Hiryu's captain, Rear Admiral Tomoe Yamaguchi, immediately prepared a counterstrike. At 10:40 a.m., he launched 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters toward the American carriers. Then, at 12:45 p.m., he launched a second strike of 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. Yamaguchi was determined to make the Americans pay for their success. The Japanese strikes found Yorktown. At 12 p.m., the first wave attacked. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire shot down most of the attackers, but 3 dive bombers broke through and scored hits on Yorktown. Bombs penetrated the flight deck and exploded below, starting fires and killing crew. The carrier's boilers were shut down by the explosions. Yorktown lost power and drifted to a stop, listing and burning. But Yorktown's damage control teams were excellent. They fought the fires, restored power, and even patched the flight deck well enough to resume operations. By 2 p.m., Yorktown was underway again at 20 knots, recovering aircraft. She seemed to have been saved. But then the second Japanese strike arrived. The torpedo bombers attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault that overwhelmed the defenses. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown on her port side. The explosions tore massive holes in her hull. Water flooded in. The carrier began to list heavily. Power failed again, this time completely. Yorktown's captain, believing the ship was going to capsize, ordered abandon ship. The Americans now had only 2 operational carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. But they had one crucial advantage. They knew where Hiryu was. The Japanese bombers that attacked Yorktown had been tracked back to their source. At 3:30 p.m., 24 dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu and attacked. 4 bombs struck the carrier. Like her sisters earlier that day, Hiryu erupted in flames and explosions. Her engines stopped. Fire spread beyond control. By evening, Hiryu was a burning hulk, dead in the water. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship. He and Hiryu's captain remained on the burning bridge, refusing rescue. As night fell, they saluted the emperor and perished when Hiryu sank in the early morning hours of June 5th. Yamaguchi was one of Japan's finest naval officers, and his death was a significant loss. By the evening of June 4th, the battle's outcome was decided. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, all 4 that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Thousands of sailors were dead, and hundreds of experienced pilots had perished with their carriers. American losses were significant. Yorktown sunk, over 140 aircraft destroyed, over 300 men killed, but the Americans had won a decisive victory. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard Yamato, far to the west, received the disaster reports with shock and disbelief. His carefully planned operation had collapsed into catastrophe. He briefly considered bringing his battleships forward for a night surface action, hoping to salvage something from the debacle. But his staff convinced him it was hopeless. The American carriers could strike his remaining ships in the morning, and without his own carriers for air cover, his battleships would be helpless. Yamamoto gave the order to retreat. Operation MI was over. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan would never again possess the offensive strength to threaten Allied positions seriously. The loss of 4 carriers and their irreplaceable air groups crippled Japanese naval aviation for the rest of the war. Japan built new carriers, but replacing the skilled pilots lost at Midway proved impossible. American pilot training programs would eventually produce thousands of skilled aviators, but Japan's training system could not keep pace with losses. Strategically, Midway shifted the initiative in the Pacific from Japan to the United States. Before Midway, Japan was advancing across the Pacific, seemingly unstoppable. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive, gradually losing ground to American offensives. The first American offensive, the invasion of Guadalcanal 2 months after Midway, began the long road back across the Pacific that would end 3 years later in Tokyo Bay. The battle also validated several important lessons about naval warfare. Intelligence was decisive. American code-breaking had provided Nimitz with priceless information about Japanese plans. Carriers were the dominant weapons. Battleships, including Yamamoto's mighty Yamato, played no role in the battle. Air superiority was essential. Once Japan lost its carriers, its remaining ships were vulnerable and had to retreat. And luck played a role. The timing of the American dive bomber attacks was extraordinarily fortunate. The 5 minutes that changed the battle, 10:22 to 10:27 a.m. on June 4th, have been analyzed endlessly by historians and military analysts. What if McCluskey had not decided to continue his search beyond his planned course? What if the lone Japanese destroyer had not appeared to guide him toward the carriers? What if the torpedo bomber attacks had not drawn the combat air patrol down to sea level? What if the dive bombers had arrived 5 minutes earlier or later when the Japanese carriers' decks were clear and their fighters properly positioned? These questions highlight how close the battle was, how easily it might have turned out differently. If the Japanese carriers had launched their strike 5 minutes earlier, they would have been airborne when the American dive bombers arrived. The outcome might have been vastly different. But history is made of such moments, when split-second timing and luck combine with skill and courage to determine the fate of nations. For the men who fought at Midway, the battle was a mixture of terror, bravery, loss, and triumph.
The dive bomber pilots who held their screaming dives through anti-aircraft fire to release their bombs at the perfect moment. The damage control teams aboard Yorktown who fought fires and flooding to save their ship. The Japanese sailors trapped below decks on burning carriers, dying in darkness and smoke. All of them, American and Japanese, were young men doing their duty in a war they did not start, paying the ultimate price for their nation's ambitions and conflicts. The battle's legacy extends beyond World War II. Midway demonstrated that war in the modern age would be decided by technology, intelligence, and industrial capacity as much as by traditional military virtues of courage and skill. The side with better intelligence, more advanced technology, and greater industrial production would eventually prevail. Japan had courage and skill in abundance, but America had the intelligence network, the technology, and the industrial might. Midway was the moment when those American advantages began to assert themselves decisively. Today, the waters where the Battle of Midway was fought are empty and peaceful. The wrecks of the carriers lie 3 miles below the surface, slowly being reclaimed by the ocean. The men who died there are gone, remembered by their families and honored by their nations. But the battle itself lives on in history as one of those rare moments when the course of human events shifted dramatically in a matter of minutes. The Battle of Midway reminds us that history is not predetermined, that individual decisions and actions can change the world, and that courage and sacrifice in defense of one's nation and comrades are virtues that transcend nationality and time. The young men who fought at Midway, both American and Japanese, displayed these virtues in full measure.
We honor their memory by remembering their sacrifice and by striving to build a world where such sacrifices are no longer necessary. June 4th, 1942, began as just another day in the Pacific War, but it ended as the day that changed everything. 5 minutes of dive bomber attacks, coming at exactly the right moment when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, shifted the balance of the Pacific War irrevocably. From that day forward, Japan's empire began its slow but inexorable decline, while America began its rise to victory. Those 5 minutes, and the men who made them possible, changed the course of history and shaped the world we live in today. The immediate aftermath of the battle was chaotic and heartbreaking for both sides. As night fell on June 4th, the ocean was littered with debris and survivors. Japanese sailors clung to wreckage, hoping for rescue that in many cases would never come. The destroyers and cruisers of the Japanese fleet did what they could, pulling men from the water, but hundreds were left behind when Yamamoto ordered the retreat. Those men faced a terrible choice: try to swim toward distant Midway and almost certainly drown from exhaustion, or wait in the water for rescue that might never arrive. Most chose to wait. Most died. The scenes aboard the burning Japanese carriers before they sank were apocalyptic. On Akagi, fires raged out of control for an entire day. Damage control teams fought desperately, but the flames kept spreading. Exploding ammunition made whole sections of the ship inaccessible. By the evening of June 4th, it was clear Akagi could not be saved. The order came to abandon ship. Sailors lined up in orderly fashion despite the chaos and flames and climbed down ropes into the water or onto rescue vessels alongside. The Japanese Navy's discipline held, even in disaster. Early on June 5th, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into Akagi's hull to send her to the bottom rather than let her drift as a derelict. She sank quickly, taking with her the bodies of hundreds of men who had died in the fires or been trapped below decks. Kaga's end came sooner. The carrier had been hit hardest by the American dive bombers, and her fires were the most severe. Explosions ripped through the ship throughout the afternoon. The entire forward half of the carrier was engulfed in flames. By late afternoon, the captain ordered abandon ship. Sailors jumped into the water from wherever they could, some from heights of 40 or 50 feet. Kaga sank at 7:25 p.m. on June 4th, going down by the bow. Over 800 of her crew died with her or in the water afterward. Soryu was the first to sink, going under at 7:13 p.m. on June 4th, just 9 hours after being hit. Her smaller size meant she had less reserve buoyancy than her larger sisters. The bomb hits had caused catastrophic damage, and despite heroic damage control efforts, flooding could not be contained. Her captain, Ryosaku Yamamoto, chose to go down with his ship, lashing himself to the bridge so he could maintain his post to the end. Over 700 of Soryu's crew perished. Hiruyu lasted longer but suffered the same fate. Hit by 4 bombs in the late afternoon, she burned through the night. Admiral Yamaguchi, who had fought so aggressively after the other carriers were hit, refused to leave. He and Captain Tomeo Kaku remained on the bridge, sending final messages to the combined fleet. At 2 a.m. on June 5th, they ordered the crew to abandon ship. The surviving crew members gathered on the stern and sang the Japanese national anthem, then jumped into the darkness. Yamamoto and Kaku remained behind. At 5:10 a.m., Hiruyu rolled over and sank. The admiral and captain were never seen again. Over 400 men died with Hiruyu. The American side had its own tragedy unfolding. Yorktown, hit by bombs and torpedoes, had been abandoned on the afternoon of June 4th, but the tough carrier refused to sink. She remained afloat, listing heavily but stable. On June 5th, salvage teams returned to the ship, hoping to tow her back to Pearl Harbor. Throughout June 5th and into June 6th, teams worked aboard the carrier, fighting residual fires, pumping out water, attaching tow lines. It seemed possible Yorktown might be saved. But the Japanese submarine I-168 had been ordered to find and sink any damaged American ships. On the afternoon of June 6th, I-168 found Yorktown under tow, protected by several destroyers. The submarine commander, Yahachi Tanabe, maneuvered his boat with great skill, evading the destroyer's depth charge attacks. He penetrated the screen and fired 4 torpedoes at close range. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown. A third hit the destroyer USS Hamon, which was alongside Yorktown providing power. Hamon broke in half and sank in 4 minutes, killing 80 of her crew. The torpedo hits on Yorktown were catastrophic. The carrier, already damaged, could not survive additional flooding. Water poured through the new holes in her hull. The list increased. Throughout the night of June 6th-7th, Yorktown's list grew steeper. At dawn on June 7th, she rolled over and sank. She went down in 3,000 fathoms of water, taking with her the bodies of those killed in the earlier attacks. Over 140 of Yorktown's crew died in the battle and sinking, a small number compared to Japanese losses, but still a terrible price.
For Admiral Fletcher, who had commanded from Yorktown, the carrier's loss was intensely personal. He had fought his ship brilliantly, launching strikes at the crucial moment and defending against Japanese attacks. But in the end, his flagship was gone. Fletcher transferred to a cruiser and continued commanding the American force until relieved by Admiral Spruanza. Fletcher would be criticized by some historians for his caution during the battle, but his decisions were sound given the information he had. He had won a great victory, even though it cost him his ship. The human cost of Midway was significant on both sides. Japan lost approximately 3,057 men killed, including some of their most experienced carrier pilots and crew. These were not just numbers, but individuals, young men with families, dreams, and futures that were extinguished in the fires and waters of the Pacific. The loss of experienced pilots was particularly devastating for Japan. These men had trained for years before the war and had gained combat experience in China and during the first 6 months of the Pacific War. Replacing their aircraft was possible. Replacing their skill and experience was not. America lost 307 men killed, including the entire crews of the torpedo squadrons that made their brave but futile attacks. Each of those men knew the odds were against them, but attacked anyway. Their sacrifice was not in vain. By drawing the Japanese defenses down to wave-top height, they created the opportunity for the dive bombers to attack unopposed. Military historians debate whether the torpedo attacks were necessary for the dive bombers' success, but the men who flew those obsolete devastators into the teeth of Japanese defenses deserve to be remembered as heroes who gave their lives for their country and their shipmates. The pilots who survived the battle carried memories of those who didn't. They had watched friends and squadron mates shot down, seen parachutes that never opened, observed men struggling in the water as their planes sank. Wade McCluskey, who led the decisive dive bomber attack, was wounded during his dive and barely made it back to Enterprise. He recovered and continued serving, but he never forgot June 4th and the men who didn't return. Years later, veterans of the battle would gather at reunions, fewer each year as age took its toll, and remember the friends who stayed forever young in the waters off Midway. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent hours in the water after his plane was shot down.
He hid under his seat cushion to avoid being strafed by Japanese fighters, then watched from the water as the entire battle unfolded around him. He saw the Japanese carriers burning. He watched aircraft taking off and landing. He observed the battle from a perspective unique in military history, as a front-row spectator floating in the middle of the combat zone. He was rescued the next day by a PBY and returned to tell the story of his squadron's sacrifice. Gay became one of the most famous veterans of Midway, speaking and writing about the battle for the rest of his life, ensuring that his dead comrades would not be forgotten. The news of the victory at Midway was kept secret for some time. The American government didn't want Japan to know how much damage had been inflicted, or to reveal that American intelligence had broken Japanese codes. Initial press reports were vague, mentioning a naval battle near Midway with losses on both sides. It wasn't until later that the full extent of the victory became public. When it did, the news electrified the American public. After 6 months of defeats and retreats, finally there was a clear victory. The Navy had struck back at Japan and won decisively. In Japan, the news was suppressed even more thoroughly. The government could not admit to the Japanese people that 4 fleet carriers had been lost in a single day. Such a defeat would undermine public morale and raise uncomfortable questions about the military's competence. Official announcements mentioned a battle near Midway with losses on both sides, but claimed a Japanese victory. The truth was hidden from the Japanese public. Survivors of the sunken carriers were quarantined when they returned to Japan, forbidden to discuss what had happened. The deception worked. Most Japanese civilians didn't learn the truth about Midway until after the war ended. But within the Japanese military, the defeat could not be hidden. Admiral Yamamoto was devastated. His grand plan had failed catastrophically. The carriers he needed to destroy the American fleet were gone. His strategy of forcing a decisive battle had backfired. Yamamoto had gambled everything on Midway and lost. He submitted his resignation, but it was refused. The emperor and the military leadership needed Yamamoto to continue leading the combined fleet, if only to maintain the appearance of confidence and continuity. Yamamoto would never recover from Midway. The confident, aggressive admiral who had planned Pearl Harbor became cautious and defensive. He continued to command, but seemed to have lost his touch. He developed an obsession with recapturing Guadalcanal after the Americans invaded in August 1942, pouring resources into that campaign that might have been better used elsewhere. In April 1943, American fighters intercepted and shot down Yamamoto's plane over Bougainville after American codebreakers learned of his inspection tour. Yamamoto died in the jungle, killed by American bullets. Some historians argue that Midway killed Yamamoto spiritually, even though he lived another 11 months. The architect of Pearl Harbor never recovered from the disaster at Midway.
American training also benefited from superior training infrastructure. More training carriers, more practice aircraft, more fuel for training flights, more instructors. By 1943, American training programs were producing thousands of carrier-qualified pilots per year. The quality of individual American pilots might have been lower than the pre-war Japanese elite, but American pilots were numerous, well-trained, and flying superior aircraft. In warfare, quantity has a quality all its own. The battle also highlighted the importance of damage control. American carriers at Midway demonstrated remarkable resilience. Yorktown, hit by bombs in the first Japanese strike, was back in operation within 2 hours. Only the second strike with torpedoes finally sank her, and even then she stayed afloat for 2 more days.
American damage control training, equipment, and procedures were simply better than their Japanese equivalents. American ships had better subdivision, better firefighting equipment, better trained damage control parties. Japanese damage control, by contrast, was inadequate. The Japanese Navy emphasized offensive power over defensive resilience. Japanese carriers had larger air groups than American carriers of similar size, but this was achieved partly by reducing internal subdivision and damage control spaces. When Japanese carriers were hit, fires spread rapidly through open spaces. Damage control parties lacked proper equipment and training. The result was that Japanese carriers, once seriously damaged, almost always sank. American carriers, by contrast, often survived damage that would have sunk Japanese ships. This difference in damage control philosophy reflected deeper cultural and operational differences between the two navies. The Japanese Navy emphasized the offensive spirit, the importance of striking first and striking hard. Defense and resilience were seen as less important, almost dishonorable. The American Navy, influenced by its engineering culture and industrial mindset, valued survivability and sustainability. American ships were designed to take damage and keep fighting. This philosophy paid enormous dividends at Midway and throughout the war. The intelligence dimension of Midway deserves special attention. The American victory was made possible by the work of cryptanalysts like Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo. These men, working in a basement at Pearl Harbor with primitive computing equipment, had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to provide Admiral Nimitz with priceless intelligence about Japanese plans. Rochefort's team worked around the clock in the weeks before Midway, intercepting and decrypting Japanese messages, piecing together the enemy's intentions. Rochefort himself was an unusual figure, a brilliant cryptanalyst who wore a smoking jacket and slippers to work and operated on his own schedule. His superiors in Washington didn't always appreciate his methods or his personality. After Midway, despite his crucial contribution to the victory, Rochefort was denied the Distinguished Service Medal that Nimitz recommended. Bureaucratic rivalries and jealousies in the Navy's intelligence establishment led to Rochefort being reassigned away from cryptanalysis. It was a shameful episode that highlighted how even in wartime, institutional politics could override merit. Rochefort was finally awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in 1986 posthumously, a recognition that came 4 decades too late. The intelligence success at Midway had to be carefully protected. If Japan discovered that America had broken their codes, they would change the codes and the intelligence advantage would be lost. This meant that some uses of the intelligence had to be foregone to protect the source. It also meant that the victory at Midway could not be fully explained to the American public. The real story, that American codebreakers had read Japanese plans and set a trap, remained classified for years after the war. Japan did eventually realize their codes had been compromised, though exactly when and how much they knew remains debated. After Midway, Japanese communications became more cautious. Code changes were made, but Japan never fully appreciated the extent to which their communications had been penetrated. Throughout the rest of the war, American cryptanalysts continued to provide valuable intelligence on Japanese operations, though never again with the clarity and precision that made Midway possible. The Battle of Midway has been studied exhaustively by military historians, naval officers, and strategists. Countless books, articles, documentaries, and academic papers have analyzed every aspect of the battle. The consensus is that Midway was indeed the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment that Japan's offensive momentum was broken and the strategic initiative passed to America. Some revisionist historians have argued that Japan was doomed anyway due to America's industrial superiority, and that Midway merely accelerated the inevitable. There is truth to this argument. Japan could not have won a long war against America's industrial might, but Midway ensured the war would be shorter and less costly than it might have otherwise. Without the victory at Midway, Japan would have retained its carrier superiority for months or even years longer. The American offensives that began with Guadalcanal might have been delayed or might have failed. The war might have dragged on into 1946 or beyond, with casualties on both sides multiplying. Midway did not guarantee Allied victory. That would require 3 more years of hard fighting. But it made that victory possible in 1945 rather than later. The battle also influenced post-war naval thinking. Midway demonstrated conclusively that aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the dominant weapons of naval warfare. The battleship era that had lasted since the Dreadnought Revolution of 1906 was over. After World War II, no nation would build new battleships. Carriers became the capital ships of modern navies. The lessons of Midway, the importance of air superiority, the vulnerability of surface ships to air attack, the value of intelligence and reconnaissance, shaped naval doctrine for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. The physical location of the battle, Midway Atoll itself, remained an American military base throughout the Cold War. The airfield that the Japanese had tried to destroy was expanded and improved. For decades, Midway served as a strategic outpost in the Pacific, a reminder of the battle fought in its waters. In recent years, Midway has been converted to a wildlife refuge, home to millions of seabirds. The military presence has ended, but the history remains. Visitors to Midway can still see some remnants of the battle: bunkers, gun emplacements, memorials to the fallen. The wrecks of the carriers lie on the ocean floor, slowly deteriorating. In 1998, a research expedition led by Dr. Robert Ballard located the wreck of Yorktown, sitting upright on the bottom in excellent condition despite being underwater for 56 years. The images of Yorktown's wreck, her hull intact, and her aircraft elevators still recognizable, brought home the reality of the battle to a new generation. Later expeditions found and documented some of the Japanese carriers, though the wrecks are in worse condition, broken and scattered. These wrecks are war graves, the final resting places of thousands of men. International agreements protect them from salvage or disturbance. They remain as they sank, monuments to the men who died and the battle that changed history. Occasionally, submersibles visit the wrecks to document their condition and pay respects to the fallen. Each visit reinforces the sobering reality of what happened in those waters in June 1942. For the veterans of Midway, the battle remained the defining moment of their lives.
They had been young men, many still teenagers, thrust into a battle that would determine the fate of nations. They had seen friends die, had faced death themselves, had experienced terror and triumph in equal measure. Those experiences marked them forever. Many went on to distinguished military or civilian careers, but none ever forgot Midway. The reunions of Midway veterans became annual events, opportunities for the survivors to gather and remember. As the years passed and the veterans aged, the reunions became more poignant. Each year fewer veterans attended. Each year there were more empty chairs. The youngest veterans of Midway are now in their late 90s or have passed on. Soon there will be no living participants left, and Midway will pass entirely from living memory into history. But the battle's significance ensures it will not be forgotten. Midway ranks with Salamis, Trafalgar, and Tsushima as one of the decisive naval battles in history. It was the battle where a numerically inferior force defeated a superior enemy through better intelligence, better timing, and better luck. It was the battle where 5 minutes changed the course of a war. It was the battle where young men, American and Japanese, fought with extraordinary courage for their countries and comrades. The lessons of Midway extend beyond military strategy and naval tactics. The battle teaches us about the role of chance in human affairs, how unexpected events and split-second timing can alter the course of history. It teaches us about the importance of intelligence and information in warfare and competition. It teaches us about courage and sacrifice, as demonstrated by men like those of Torpedo Squadron 8, who pressed home hopeless attacks, knowing they would likely die. It teaches us about resilience, as Yorktown's crew demonstrated by saving her ship not once but twice before she finally sank. Most fundamentally, Midway teaches us that in warfare nothing is predetermined. Japan seemed unstoppable in June 1942. 6 months of victories had created an empire stretching across Asia and the Pacific. Japanese naval officers were confident, perhaps overconfident, in their superiority. But in 5 minutes, that confidence was shattered and that momentum broken. The American underdogs, outnumbered and outgunned, achieved a victory that changed the trajectory of the war. June 4, 1942, began as one day among thousands in World War II. It ended as one of the most important days in the entire war, perhaps in the entire 20th century. The men who fought that day, on both sides, could not have known how significant their actions would prove to be. They were simply sailors and airmen, doing their duty, fighting for their countries and comrades. But their collective actions in those June skies and waters determined that the Pacific War would end in Allied victory, that Japan's empire would be broken, that the post-war world would be shaped by American power rather than Japanese dominance. The Battle of Midway was 5 minutes that changed everything. 5 minutes that cost thousands of lives, but saved countless more by shortening the war. 5 minutes that demonstrated the courage of young men in combat. 5 minutes that shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. 5 minutes that echo through history even now, 8 decades later, reminding us of the courage, sacrifice, and chance that determine the fate of nations and the course of human events.